Hi and welcome to our podcast. I'm very glad that our guest today is Abdulrazak Gurnah. Welcome to our podcast. I'm looking forward to our discussion. I'm guessing that everybody that have interviewed you here until now, or maybe other interviewers in other countries, are very keen to talk with you about your fiction books. But I'm also curious, a little bit curious about your work and your research as an academic, as a professor. So if you want, I would like to start from there because I read some of your papers and I found them very interesting. But before asking about that, I'm curious, how was it when you came to the United Kingdom as a young man, a young student? You started studying there and you wanted a career in academia. How was the climate there then for the discipline of, literary studies, post-colonial studies? How was African literature viewed then, and what changed from when you entered the system?
It was, of course, as you might expect, somebody 18 years old in a strange country, more or less on his own, with my brother and I, but no adult, as it were, just us two. So there were a lot of things to learn and find out about. Some of them quite difficult, because again, we didn't really understand the kind of hostility that we would meet. You said climate. What was the climate like? But I don't think you mean the climate in terms of the weather.
No.
You mean kind of social.
Yeah, social climate. Yeah.
Okay. So there was something quite big going on at the time in the United Kingdom, which we didn't know about, which is the whole idea of people coming from the formerly colonized parts of the world. And what was going on was really kind of the United Kingdom, particularly England, coming to terms with the arrival of people from territories and countries that they had formerly colonized. And they called these people immigrants. They didn't call other people, say from parts of Europe, something immigrants. In some way, immigrants meant black people who were coming into the UK. And it was something that was in the process of being, or rather of the society coming to terms with this, the arrival of certain people from the West Indies, from India, from Pakistan at that time. We didn't know all of this. So we came into this at a time when there was a little bit of an uproar about these things. But it wasn't all like that. I mean, it was also something of an adventure, coming to a new place, so much to learn. There was an element of, sadness about it because, memories of what you've left behind were still things I had not expected. To sort those things out. So it was a very, very full time. Lots of things to know about and learn and become accustomed to. And then also learn in a new educational institution, etc. In many ways difficult, but that's what it is, to go to another place, to be a stranger in another place. But it kind of worked out.
Wow. I'm very glad that you said that you were curious and you felt like there were a lot of things to learn, because I think this is also a great resource for studying, for researching this curiosity. So my question is, did you know from the start, when you start studying in England, that you wanted to be an academic or researcher? It was hard to become one as an immigrant, as they have seen you there? It was a hard thing to do that?
Well, I didn't think of it like that. The main reason for wanting to be there in England, it could have been somewhere else. It didn't have to be England. Was to study, to actually acquire a profession, and to also at the same time just to fulfill whatever abilities you think you possess. And in those days, it was very soon after independence. For us, it was like 3 years since we were not a colony. We were kind of getting a lot of information and advice that the thing to do is to learn skills that are going to be useful to your country. And what were these skills? Engineering or medicine or that kind of thing. So that's what I was studying, to become an engineer, really, or getting ready to become one, to start a course like that. But then the money ran out, because we were funding ourselves a little bit, as much as we could, and working and so on. The money ran out, and so I was working for about 3 years or so. And during that time, then I came to, so then I became much more confident in understanding how to live there, thinking, I don't really want to do this. What I want to study is literature. So when I was able to return to studying, that's what I did. I studied literature. And I did think, because it was quite difficult, really, one way or another, I didn't think of careers as like an academic. So I'll be a teacher. In fact, that's what my first job was, a school teacher. But my teachers encouraged me and said, no, why don't you go on to do postgraduate studies? Why don't you go on to do a PhD? Why don't you? And if you do a PhD in literature, there's really more or less only one career available to you, if you're lucky these days, and that is to become an academic, a scholar. So that's how it happened.
I agree with you. Nowadays, I don't know how it was then, but nowadays I think it's a little bit more harder.
It's more difficult to find academic jobs.
Yeah,
it was always difficult, but now it's even more difficult.
And when came the writing of fiction? Because you started writing fiction, or you published a little bit later, after you got your PhD, right? But I think I have read somewhere that you have started writing fiction just for yourself a little bit earlier. How did you start doing this? And why did you?
Yes. Well, I also that there's writing and there is another thing that we call writing. In other words, many people write. And what they write is often not intended for anybody else. It's writing for themselves, or perhaps to their loved one to see. It might be writing down something that troubles a person, and writing is a way of kind of disentangling ideas, or it might be out of a kind of a sadness, and so writing about it is like a self-pity therapy, and so on. It makes you feel better because you've unloaded it, as it were. But most of these things are not really intended for people you don't know. When you start writing with the awareness that I'm writing this and I don't know who's going to read it, and therefore I have to write it in a way that shapes it, makes it clear, understandable, impressive, beautiful, or whatever, then that becomes an aspiration to art, as it were. You're aspiring to produce something which is well made and which is going to be made available to people who don't know who you are, and therefore will not be inclined to be kind or anything like that, like your friend or your mother or your whatever. And I think that's when you're writing for a reader. So for that to happen, it takes a while. I think it takes time to be able to make that decision from just writing to that point where you say, okay, I'm going to send this to an editor or a publisher. I don't know who this person is, and I don't know what they'll say. Most of the time they say, no, thank you. But you persist if you're interested, and I think this is the advice. People say, what advice would you give to a young writer? Or somebody who wants to become a writer? And I always say, well, you have to keep doing it. You have to keep doing it until either you get published, or if you don't, after whatever, 15 years or so, then you say, well, maybe I'm trying for the wrong thing, so maybe I should stop. But it's like that. I think it's not unique. I think every writer, more or less, has to go through this process of trying to find a publisher, trying to persuade somebody that, yes, this is interesting, this is good, publish it. And even then, that's only the beginning of the story.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
You have mentioned that it's different to write for yourself and to write for a reader, to have a reader in mind, to have maybe an audience in mind. Did you have this problem about, writing about Zanzibar or Africa or this theme of exile and maybe of your home country in general for an English-speaking audience, for for readers from England? Did you feel like some pressure that you have to write in a way, or there are some expectations from you in this sense?
Not exactly, not directly, not like that. Of course, I was already reading quite a lot, and could see at the time that I was able to engage with writing about places that I didn't know. So it might be, say, American or South American or Eastern European or Russian or whatever. I could read books, or Indian, I could read books by writers from these places telling me about what it was like to be in those places. It was not that they were trying to tell me, they didn't know who I am, but they're writing about places they know in ways that they know how to. And they're not necessarily thinking what nationality is the person who's going to be reading this.
Yeah.
So you write with whatever truthfulness and precision that you can bring to the process, because well, at least I think, you don't have a particular reader in mind. So if it works, anybody, anywhere in the world should be able to, if they can read in the language that it's written in, should be able to pick up that text and read it. And they might have a different response. They might say, yes, that's right, that's exactly how it is. Or they might say, I didn't know that, but it's very interesting. Or it's a little bit like what I know, but there's another way of... So in other words, we can still engage.
Yeah.
We can still engage even if it's not something we knew something about beforehand.
Okay. And I think also we have to keep in mind that readers are very different, and we cannot expect to receive good reviews from everybody. So
well, it's not even a matter of good and bad reviews.
Yeah.
It's really a matter of how much you can take from a text as a reader. If you're reading something, and let's say if you're not a very practiced reader, for example, if you're young or if you're not a scholar of reading, maybe you might read something and you might get 50% of it. Some of it you read over quickly, but you don't really fully understand, which is why rereading is so pleasurable at times, because when you read again, you think, I didn't see that, or I didn't understand that, so that's what it means. And so we don't always, or not all readers get what's in there at once. Sometimes you only get part of it, and sometimes you have to read again if you're interested, or sometimes you're reading at the wrong time. Your mind is perhaps distracted by other things, and you can't give the text your full attention. So there are all kinds of conditions that come into it. But what you do know, I think, on the whole, is that I'm getting pleasure from this, even if I'm not getting 100%, but I'm getting pleasure from this. So I'll return to this, or alternatively, in years to come, I'll go back and read this.
I must confess, this is my experience with your books. Even though I didn't know all the information, the context, the historical facts that are behind your stories, I really enjoyed them. So I didn't think I had to know everything about the colonial presence in East Africa to really enjoy your story and your characters. So I think you really exemplify this with your books. But talking about reading, I must ask you, you have to be a good reader in order to be a good writer? Is this a basic condition?
Well, I think it helps. I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but I think it helps you to both see what others are doing, not because they're going to teach you how to do what you do. You have to find your own way of doing it, but you see what's possible to do. That's one thing. And the other thing is that a lot of writing is intertextual.
Yes.
Connects with other texts, whether those are contemporary or whether those are texts that are, kind of very much central to that culture. So if you're writing in English, it's almost certain that somehow the other Shakespeare will appear in some form, either by direct reference or by a sentence or two that you don't even know that you're quoting from a Shakespeare text, because it's so much part of the language of literature. I think it's actually also much more enjoyable if you are aware of other texts and are able to bring other texts into it. For the reader, speaking as a reader now, I love it when I think, I know what you're doing. You're kind of making a reference to whatever, even if it's not necessary. But it's part of the enjoyment of reading and of writing that we're aware of other kinds of or other texts, and and can make reference to them. I think so, anyway.
Speaking about influences, I have read also some of your reviews on African authors, and I'm curious what authors from what spaces did have an impact on you. Do you have influences from African literature, European literature, from other spaces? Do you have like a personal canon? Because I felt I saw some European influences in your books, but because I'm not so accustomed with African writers, maybe I didn't get them. But I also think that there are maybe some influences. Who or what influenced you in this sense, literally speaking, in writing your fiction?
I can't really answer that question. Because I've been doing this for a long time, and I've read many, many, many books, both as a writer and also as a teacher. So I don't know I know which writers at one time or another I enjoyed very much. It doesn't always stay that way. You move on. There's a period when there are certain writers are very important for whatever reason, because maybe you're learning about that situation for the first time, maybe reading American writing. I remember in my sort of early years in England, which we hadn't read before, or not very much before. So in that period, I was reading all these contemporary important writers like Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Bernard Malamud, Norman Mailer, etc. Almost all of them Jewish at that time. So it was a way of understanding a condition as well as a society, as well as how writing is done about those things. But then, we move on into 19th century writing, for example, in British writing, when I started to teach African writing, because that was what I did my PhD on, etc. So there are different influences, if you think of it like that, although I don't think of it as influences. I think the important thing for a writer is not so much to be influenced, but to recognize that individual voice, as it were. I say it like this because for me, I hear it. To recognize that and to be able to produce that, to say this is how I see it. For that, I don't think you need influence.
Yeah.
You need to be able to hear your own voice and to be able to make it heard.
And to distinguish your voice from maybe other voices.
Which
right?
doesn't mean that you don't admire others.
Yeah.
But you have to find your own. And that's what makes a writer, that each writer has an originality. The originality comes from that way of seeing, that a writer that is, interesting, produces something that makes you, the reader, think, not so much even think in an aware way, I've never seen this, I've never heard it said quite like this. But that's what I think is what we feel when you come across something that you really like or that impresses, because it tells you something in a way that you have not quite come across before, in however small a way.
Well, I think it's very on point, and it captures, I think, from my opinion, what it means to be a writer and what is originality, right? So I have asked this question of influences, if you like it or not, because reading Paradise, I thought a lot about The Magic Mountain of Thomas Mann, and I felt like it was like some kind of dialogue there because it's in some way it's a Bildungsroman, paradise, and we have all these characters, all these men that tell a lot of stories that help Yusuf to grow up, but in the end he goes to the war basically. I mean, it's not said directly that he goes to war, but he goes away with soldier. And I asked you this because I thought it's like some kind of dialogue with this very important European novel, and you gave like some kind of response, or maybe you did something in relation to Thomas Mann, but
I'm afraid not.
No, right.
It was only it was after it that I read The Magic Mountain, so it wasn't anything to do during the writing. But then that's a lot of writing does that. I mean, coming from different places, and then you find some overlap, and it's always interesting to say, did this person know about such and such? But I guess in a way it says something about human experience.
Yeah, totally agree with you. We have some experience that are universal, and I mean, it doesn't matter where it happened, it might be some common elements.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
But I'm also curious, was it hard at the beginning of your career as a fiction writer to glide between academic writing and fiction writing? Because from what I have read from you, I don't get that feeling like I get with other writers that have a academic career as you, that they are very seduced by big ideas, theory, and things like that. No, you're a very good storyteller, and you captivated me with the way you were telling stories. And I feel like you really knew how to detach yourself from that. But it was hard to do that in the beginning, to glide from these two types of writing and experiences? No?
No, it wasn't. Well, I think because academic writing is quite a different form of discourse from fiction writing. It has its own rules. You have to be circumspect how you say, how you offer an opinion. You have to have quotations and backing it up, and various critiques, and so the whole process is one of careful, steady, making an argument and making it stand, and so on. It has its limitations, therefore, but what can be said and what can't be said. Fiction doesn't have any. And really, it doesn't mean, therefore, you can be outrageous, but it does mean that you can allow a certain kind of inventiveness without hesitation. And as confidence grows, then I found I was able to kind of, without any anxiety, allow this intuitive way of thinking to just lead me on to different ways of saying things. Whereas with academic writing, although there is, of course, also an intuitive learning as well, you have a response to what you're reading, but you have to then analyze that response and see it in context and make the case, etc. So for me, there were different kinds of things, and I did them in different places. So I only ever wrote my academic work in my office at the university, and I only wrote fiction at home in my study. So different places, and that kind of helped to separate these two activities as well.
That's actually a very good idea to have like separate spaces, because also you create a mind space for yourself. So when you're there, you kind of get in the focus of academic writing because you have to be in that focus.
Yeah.
And you can concentrate in another place.
Yes,
So,
and my academic books are in my office at work.
and that's in your home.
And not in my home. So.
Wow. I'm also curious about talking about this intersection between fiction and academic. You have been described or maybe put in this category of a post-colonial writer, but you have also theorized, and you wrote about what is a post-colonial writer, and you debated about this. So my question is, what is this concept of post-colonial writer? What is for you?
Yes,
this
well,
tag.
At the time when I was a student, the time when I was doing my PhD, for example, these different areas of study in the discipline of literature, particularly, but not only in literature, were divided by places of origin. So you had African studies, Indian studies, Caribbean studies, maybe others like this. And it was as if these were discrete, separate places. So those who were studying African studies would do literature, anthropology, history, geography, etc. of that area, as if they were separate from other areas. And clearly this is not true. Not only are they not separate, but for many parts of the world, historically speaking, they have almost kind of overlapping histories of colonialism, for example, of being colonized by European powers. And the consequences of this actually cut through almost all of these in terms of literature, in terms of education, in terms of economic, etc. So when the ideas first began to say, I don't want to be just talking about African literature. I also want to talk comparatively about Indian and Arab literature at the same time. One of the ways of doing this is what became known as post-colonial discourse, because the first thing that they all have in common is their history of being colonized by Europe. The idea caught on, so then other disciplines started to use this as well. Anthropologists, for example, to say, well, the same kind of thing that was being done in Africa by anthropologists was also being done in South America, was also being done in India and whatever. So we can study that, and we can study what differences that produces. Do we see difference, or do we see the same thing? What are the same things? What kind of ideas lie behind the assumptions of Europe about the rest of the world, or the assumption of that place about Europe, or the assumption of Europe about Islam, or the assumption... So it becomes a very useful way of opening up the discourse on whatever it is. Instead of making it seem like they're all kind of discrete areas of study, we can now ask the same question about different places. So other disciplines began to adopt this, medieval studies, theology, as well as economics, and it then enters into, shall we say, popular speech. So that now people speak about post-colonial with some skepticism. What is this post-colonial? Well, in the first place, it's actually a very useful way of constructing a curriculum. In other words, it started off as something to do with how you teach texts from different places, or how you study religions from different places, or different kinds of religions. If we get tired of it, we'll find another way of asking those questions. So it's not a religion.
Yeah.
It's just a way, a methodology. And when if it doesn't work in some situations, then we'll find another way of doing it. That's how I think of it. It's not like we kind of have to fight to the death for something called post-colonial studies. It works. And while it works, let's use it as a method.
Yeah, I agree with you. But as you have said, you are very interested in capturing human experiences, maybe universal human experiences, but also talking about the realities of colonial power and all your themes. Do you feel limited when people describe you as a post-colonial writer or a writer of these exact themes? Do you feel like they limited or they don't understand you maybe?
No, I mean, I don't actually feel that any description of me is going to limit me. What it does, well, and of course that's not the only way I think I'm described. Sometimes I'm described as an African writer, sometimes I'm described as a British writer, sometimes post-colonial. It really doesn't matter very much. It certainly doesn't matter to how I do my practice, as it were. And nor does it matter enough for me to want to debate with anybody and say, no. I say, whatever you think, fine.
I mean, you have this freedom, and I think it's very good for you as a writer, because you don't feel the pressure of as you said at the beginning, of the public, of an audience. I think it's very refreshing for you as a writer. And I felt like you tried a lot of things in your novels, but I found like two directions in all of your fiction writing. You either place your stories at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, or at the end of the 20th century. Which one was more hard to do? The novels at the beginning of the century or at the end of the century? Or maybe which one is more close to you or you feel more affectionate to?
They were all hard to do in their different ways. And I have affection for all of them. So it's not like that. But they require different approaches. You know, if you're writing about a period or two early in the 20th century, for example, or late 19th, early 20th century, were about times I already knew something about. It wasn't like I was having to read about it from scratch. But then there's also the opportunity to read some more and research and whatever. What kind of uniforms did the Schutztruppe wear? That kind of thing, you know. Yeah. Contemporary ones also require another kind of research as well as thinking through. But there I have first-hand knowledge in some cases. In some cases, not in every case. So they all have their difficulties, or they all have their approach. So I don't know that I have an approach that I prefer.
I mean, I feel like you're very curious and you want to try different things. I think this is very interesting because your books are very different one from another, and I read them one after another, and I didn't get bored. So it was like
that's good.
Yeah, it was a refreshing experience. I really liked it. For example, I first read Paradise, and after that I have read, I think, Afterlives. And it was very nice to see your signature, your voice there, but to see different type of approaches. As you said, you don't have one approach, and I think it's a very good thing for a writer.
Good, thank you.
But speaking about Paradise, is the book that really stuck with me because of the atmosphere. In some way, it felt like a fairy tale because from compared to your other novels. Not all of them, but most of them, you can pinpoint most of them in time, in place, but mostly in time. But Paradise, it was like was out of time in some way, not out of space, but out of time. Well, you didn't give us many historical dates, or there were some facts, but you have to know a little bit about the history of the area. But it was like a fairy tale. It was very, very, very capturing my attention, my thoughts. I thought a lot about this book when I was reading it. So was this something intentional that you tried to do, that atmosphere maybe?
Well, not so much that fairy tale, but I suppose there were lots of stories there which couldn't be true. But that's also to do with how people imagine their world, the world they live in. So stories and telling stories, there's a lot of people telling stories to each other. Because in a way, stories, particularly in a culture which is not very literate, it's not that people were not literate, but it was still a kind of shall we say, not a general skill. So speaking to each other was much more the normal way of communicating and transmitting knowledge or transmitting opinion. So stories are also a way of saying, what kind of world do I see? So it's also a way of describing their view of the world. So that might seem like fairy tales, if you know what I mean. It might seem like it's imprecise. But I think you said that if you know the context, you probably would be able to say, this is around about maybe 1890 or 1900 or something like this. And of course the war becomes another way of saying, it must be the first decade of the 20th century, because the war is coming. So there are enough of those, but they're left imprecise because partly because we are seeing, to some extent, we're seeing all this through the eyes of Yusuf, even though he's not the narrator, but through his eyes. And he's still quite young. So perhaps to him, the world does not seem, dateable. This is, what year is this or what year is that? For him, it's more like what's happening to me. So that may well be why there is a sense of imprecision.
I remember now that there were some passages in the book when he said that Yusuf doesn't know how many days have passed, how many months. So now, I get it now. It's like the imprecision, not of the book, but of the point of view of
consciousness of the young man whose life is in other people's hands, and he doesn't know what's going on. How many months has he been here? How many weeks has he been sent to me?
Another question about paradise. I think a very important theme there is freedom, and it's a very big debate, not essayistically but fiction-wise, about freedom. What is freedom for you?
Well, what is freedom is to be able to retain some sense of yourself and keep it safe. It doesn't mean that is freedom in the sense that we think we can do what we like. But we're talking about freedom amongst people like Mzee Hamdani or Yusuf, or people who are already in some form of bondage. So how within that do you keep your freedom? So freedom is to keep something of the self safe, so that it's not crushed, so it's not somehow distorted, or so you're not forced into some kind of self-hate or self-dislike. That's freedom.
Thank you for the answer. I'm also, I agree with you, because I think if you were in that form of bondage, as you said, you also have a freedom yourself in your interior life. You can also cultivate a freedom from there, and I think Yusuf tried to do that, and in the end he wanted to let that freedom that nurtured himself in himself to open to the world.
Except that the choice he made was probably not the right choice.
Not the right choice. It was not very towards a bigger freedom, maybe right?
Not, but
maybe not. We don't know.
That's how it goes.
Yeah, there it goes. In the end, I would like to question to question you about the Nobel Prize. You have won it 3 years ago, but in a companion of English literature, you wrote about Toni Morrison Nobel Prize in '93, and 20 years after you have won it. And it's very interesting how you discuss all the context about Toni Morrison. I'm curious how you felt about Nobel Prize and what did it meant for you.
I felt very good. It was a very great honor to be asked. As you know, they give it out once a year, and everybody knows about it. So it's very good. Any writer, I think, would be delighted to be chosen in that way. Although, of course, we know it's just the Swedish Academy and not God or something like that. But nonetheless, we recognize its significance. So that's great. That's wonderful. The next wonderful thing about it is that people want to know about your work. People want to know who you are. And the result is translations, visiting Yash, and so on. So you get to meet your readers. You get to, which again, I think is what a writer would wish for, as many people to read his or her work. Well, those are the two main things, really.
Thank you so much for the discussion, and thank you to coming to our podcast. It was a pleasure to discuss about you, and I hope many people will discover your books also in Romania and worldwide. Thank you so much, and please enjoy Yash and Romania, and we will expect you to come back anytime soon.
All right, thank you very much.